They called the valve a safety hazard the moment I turned it. But 10 minutes earlier, 3 board members had used the same valve without issue, on camera. Winter had already tightened its grip on the neighborhood. Snow sat in ridges along the curbs, and the air had that dry, metallic cold that seeps through walls. In our HOA, heat came from a shared fuel system routed through a concrete service alcove behind the townhomes. Inside that alcove was the object everyone quietly depended on and rarely talked about: a heavy steel fuel shutoff valve, painted red, bolted into the main line. Turn it, and heat flowed. Restrict it, and units went cold within hours. On that morning, I was down there for a reason that wasn't dramatic at all. My thermostat had been fluctuating overnight, so I followed the maintenance instructions posted inside the alcove, laminated, HOA branded, and dated from years earlier. The instructions clearly showed the valve and explained how to cycle it briefly to stabilize pressure after a temperature drop. I pulled on gloves, knelt on the cold concrete, and turned the wheel a quarter turn. The metal resisted, then moved with a dull scrape. I waited, turned it back, and felt the line vibrate as fuel resumed. Simple, normal. As I stood up, brushing snow off my knees, headlights washed over the alcove entrance. A board member's SUV rolled past, slowed, then stopped. Another car followed. Within seconds, 2 more people were standing just outside the fence, phones already out. No one asked what I was doing. No one checked the instructions posted right behind me. One of them pointed at the valve and said, "That's dangerous. You're not authorized to touch that."
An hour later, a printed violation notice was taped to my door. The notice claimed I had tampered with critical fuel infrastructure, citing uniform safety enforcement and an immediate restriction on my access to the system. It warned that further interaction with the valve could result in penalties. The language was formal, confident, and absolute. By that evening, my unit's heat dropped noticeably. The system still functioned, but my line was clearly being throttled. The HOA had acted fast, and for the moment, they had won. What they didn't know was that I'd already seen something they hadn't. Earlier that same morning, before I ever went near the alcove, I'd been unloading groceries when I noticed activity behind the units. 2 board members and the property manager were clustered around the service area. One of them unlocked the fence, another knelt at the valve. I remember it because I paused, balancing a box, waiting for them to finish so I could pass. The valve wheel turned. I heard the same scrape of metal. No warning signs, no safety cones, no emergency tape. At the time, it meant nothing to me, but now, with a violation notice in hand, it meant everything. That night, I went back outside, not to touch the valve, but to look. The alcove light was on, casting a yellow rectangle on the snow. A small security camera sat above the entrance, its red indicator blinking steadily. I stood just outside its range, watching the valve through the fence. Frost had formed along the pipe where it entered my unit's line. I could hear the faint hum of the system working harder than it should. Inside, I laid the violation notice on the table and pulled up the HOA portal. The enforcement section listed violations by address and category. It went back years. I searched for anything related to the fuel system: valve access, infrastructure tampering, safety hazard. Nothing. I refreshed. I widened the date range. Still nothing. No prior violations, no warnings, no fines. The rule existed on paper, but enforcement history was empty. That alone was odd, but not enough. I needed something visual, something undeniable.
The next morning, just after sunrise, I watched from my kitchen window as the same SUV from the day before pulled up again. 2 people got out. One carried a clipboard. The other unlocked the alcove fence. They stepped inside. The camera's red light blinked on. I watched one of them reach for the valve and turn it slightly, then back. Steam puffed from their breath as they talked. When they left, The fence was locked again. I didn't move. I didn't confront them. I didn't record on my phone. I just noted the time. Because if the valve was truly dangerous, why did it only become dangerous when I touched it? And if the HOA was enforcing safety uniformly, why was I the only one restricted from the very system they were still actively using? That question followed me as the heat in my unit dipped again that night, and I realized something else. If this restriction stayed in place much longer, winter wouldn't just be uncomfortable, it would be evidence. So what exactly would the cameras show when the board said the rule applied to everyone? The heat dropped again overnight. Not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to make the message clear. By morning, the inside of my windows had fogged, a thin film of condensation creeping along the edges. I stood there with a mug in my hands, watching my breath faintly show in the glass reflection. The thermostat said the system was active, but the radiators clicked and hesitated, like they were being fed through a narrowed throat. Somewhere behind the units, that valve was deciding how warm my house was allowed to be. I didn't go to my laptop first. I went outside. The service alcove sat half buried in snow, its chain-link fence rattling lightly in the wind. Fresh footprints crossed the ground, several sets, overlapping, leading straight to the gate. The lock was clean, no frost on it, like it had been opened recently. I crouched and followed the prints with my eyes. They told a simple story. People were still coming here, still touching the system, still adjusting the very thing I'd been warned away from. I pulled out my phone, not to record the valve, but to record the environment, the footprints, the unlocked latch swinging back into place, the way the warning sign about unauthorized access was bent inward, as if someone brushed past it regularly without reading it. Then I stepped back, making sure the security camera above the alcove had a clear, unobstructed view of everything that happened next.
Because 10 minutes later, a familiar figure appeared. The property manager arrived with a maintenance contractor. They didn't hesitate. The manager unlocked the gate, held it open, and the contractor went straight to the valve. Gloves on, wrench out, a slight turn, a pause, another adjustment. The camera's red light blinked steadily the entire time. When they were done, the gate was locked again, and they walked away without so much as a glance toward my unit. Inside, the heat surged briefly, then settled back into that same restrained flow. That was escalation number 1, not on paper, but in plain sight. Later that afternoon, I attended the HOA's weekly open board meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, folding chairs set up in neat rows. The valve came up almost immediately. A board member stood and spoke confidently about safety protocols and recent unauthorized access. She said the restriction was temporary and applied uniformly. Uniformly. As she spoke, I watched another board member fidget with his phone, the same one I'd seen kneeling by the valve days earlier. He didn't look at me once. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I asked one question. If the valve is restricted for safety, is anyone accessing it right now? There was a pause. Then the property manager answered, only authorized personnel. That answer landed harder than any accusation could have, because authorized personnel wasn't defined anywhere in the rules they had cited. It wasn't posted at the alcove, and it certainly wasn't what the violation notice taped to my door had said. When I got home, I didn't warm up, I layered up instead, hoodie over sweater, gloves back on. Then I sat at my dining table and opened the HOA portal again. This time I wasn't searching randomly. I filtered by category and date, scrolling slowly, deliberately. Every violation had a timestamp. Every entry had a resolution status. I lined those timestamps up with what I'd already seen outside.
That evening, just after dusk, headlights swept across the snow again. Another board member's car, another visit to the alcove. I stood near my window, watching the scene unfold like a looped clip. Unlock, step in, turn the valve, step out. The camera watched it all, silently recording a version of events that directly contradicted what I'd been told in writing and in person. That was escalation number 2,
time-stamped, visual, and passive. Before going to bed, I printed the violation notice and laid it next to my phone. On the screen was a simple list I'd started compiling: dates, times, names, actions observed. No commentary, no emotion, just facts that could be verified by the same systems the HOA relied on every day. If you're following this story so far and want to see how proof, not shouting, changes everything, make sure you subscribe. The next part is where observation turns into leverage. The following morning, I noticed something new. A maintenance cone had been placed near the alcove entrance, bright orange against the snow. It looked official, it looked like compliance, but it hadn't been there the night before, and the camera would know exactly when it appeared. I stood there for a moment watching the cone wobble slightly in the wind and realized the HOA was trying to retroactively dress up what they'd already been doing, not to fix a safety issue, but to justify one narrative over another. That was escalation number 3. Not a document, not a letter, but a visible attempt to control the story. As I went back inside, the heat clicked again, uneven and restrained. I didn't touch the thermostat, I didn't go near the valve, I didn't need to, because if the board insisted this rule had always existed and always been enforced, the cameras, logs, and physical traces around that alcove were about to ask a very simple question for me. Why does uniform look so different depending on who's standing at the valve?
By the third cold morning, the house had a rhythm I didn't recognize. Heat would rise just enough to take the edge off, then quietly retreat. I started my day the same way I had the previous 2, not with emails or complaints, but by stepping outside. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the ground smooth, except where it hadn't. New footprints cut across the white surface, leading straight to the service alcove. Some were deep and heavy, others lighter, overlapping in a way that suggested people arriving separately, not together. The gate stood closed, but the latch hung crooked, not seated cleanly. That detail mattered. I circled wide, keeping the security camera in view, and stopped where I could see both the alcove and my unit's exterior vent. When the system throttled back, the vent barely breathed. When it opened, a faint shimmer of warm air distorted the cold. That vent had become my visual gauge. No instruments, no tools, just cause and effect I could see with my own eyes. Mid-morning, a pickup truck I didn't recognize rolled in. The driver stepped out wearing a contractor jacket, clipboard under one arm. He didn't look lost. He went straight to the alcove, unlocked the gate, and knelt by the valve. This time, he didn't just turn it. He marked something on his clipboard, then turned it again. The camera watched. The footprints recorded his arrival. The vent responded minutes later with a brief surge of warmth. I didn't approach. I didn't interrupt. I stood far enough back that the camera would show me doing exactly nothing. That was intentional. Inside, I opened my notebook and added another line to the list. Same structure as the others. Date, time, description. No assumptions, no conclusions, just observations that could be matched to footage, logs, and physical conditions. In the afternoon, I walked the neighborhood, slowly, casually, the kind of walk that doesn't raise questions. I passed unit after unit, noting which exterior vents were steaming consistently and which weren't. Most were fine, a few fluctuated like mine. All of those units shared the same branch of the fuel line, downstream from the valve. At one unit, I paused to retie my boot and caught a reflection in a window, a board member standing across the street watching me. He didn't wave, he didn't approach. He just stood there with his phone in hand, then walked away. That was new.
Back home, I pulled up the HOA portal again. This time, I didn't search by category. I searched by address. Mine, then others on the same line. Violations were logged for parking, trash bins, exterior decor. Nothing, absolutely nothing related to fuel access, valve interaction, or infrastructure safety. Not now, not ever. That absence was loud. As evening approached, the temperature outside dropped sharply.
the kind of cold that forces systems to work harder whether they want to or not. I watched the alcove from my window, lights off, reflection minimized. At 6:17 p.m., a board member arrived, alone. No clipboard this time, no contractor. Just him unlocking the gate, stepping inside, and turning the valve farther than I'd seen anyone else do. The heat inside my unit spiked, fast. The radiators hissed. The vent shimmered strongly for nearly 10 minutes. Then, just as suddenly, it dropped back again. I didn't need to see him turn it back. The effect told me everything. That night, I laid everything out across my table, printed screenshots of the portal's empty enforcement history, my handwritten log, photos of footprints, the cone, the latch. I didn't label them yet, I just arranged them chronologically, letting the pattern speak without commentary. One thing became clear immediately. If this were truly about safety, access would be restricted for everyone. If it were about procedure, violations would exist for everyone. Instead, access was routine for them and forbidden for me. The next morning, the HOA sent a follow-up email. It reiterated the restriction, emphasized ongoing safety concerns, and warned that compliance was expected. No mention of inspections, no mention of contractors, no acknowledgement of the daily activity at the alcove. I read it once, then went outside again. Someone had added a second cone overnight. It sat closer to the gate, positioned for visibility from the main walkway. A small laminated sign had been zip-tied to the fence. Authorized access only. The sign was crooked. The zip tie hadn't been trimmed. It was performative, and it was late. I stood where the camera could see me clearly and took a step back, hands in pockets, doing nothing. Then I waited. 20 minutes later, the property manager arrived. She paused when she saw me, hesitated, then unlocked the gate anyway. She stepped inside, adjusted the valve, and locked up without a word. The sign stayed, the cone stayed, the access continued. That was the moment the story stopped being about what I could prove and became about what they couldn't deny. Because every action they took to appear compliant only added another visual contradiction, another timestamp, another entry, another piece of physical evidence that enforcement wasn't uniform at all. As I went back inside, I didn't need to request violation histories anymore. I didn't need explanations or clarifications. I had something better, a living record of selective behavior unfolding in real time, captured by the HOA's own systems. The question now wasn't whether the rule was being enforced unfairly. The question was what would happen when I stopped watching and let someone official start asking why the footage, the logs, and the physical reality around that valve all told the same story.
The cold stopped being subtle after that. By the fourth morning, the floor near the exterior wall felt like stone. I could hear the system cycling more often, shorter bursts like it was being rationed. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even adjust the thermostat. Instead, I put on my coat and went outside before sunrise, when the neighborhood was quiet and the snow still held every mark it was given. The service alcove told its story immediately. Fresh tracks, different tread patterns. One set led straight to the gate and stopped. Another circled, as if someone paced while waiting. The latch had frost on it this time, new frost, meaning it had been opened recently enough for moisture to settle again. Above it all, the security camera blinked steadily, indifferent to who it recorded. I stood back and watched the vent on my unit. No shimmer, no distortion in the air, just stillness. At 7:42 a.m., a sedan pulled up. A board member stepped out, glanced around, then went to the gate. He hesitated just for a second when he saw the cone and the sign. Then he unlocked the gate anyway. Inside the alcove, he turned the valve slowly, deliberately, like someone trying not to be obvious. The vent responded within minutes. Heat surged. Then, 10 minutes later, it faded again. I wrote nothing down. Not yet. Instead, I went inside and opened my laptop. I logged into the HOA portal, not to search violations, but to download the enforcement policy they'd cited in my notice. It was a clean PDF, formatted professionally, full of general language about safety and authority. One line stood out now more than ever. Restrictions shall be applied consistently across all affected units. I didn't highlight it. I didn't print it. I just closed the file. That afternoon, the property manager knocked on my door. She stood with her clipboard angled slightly away from me, as if that made it less official. She reiterated the restriction verbally, told me the board was reviewing procedures, and suggested I be patient. As she spoke, I noticed her keys. One of them was the alcove gate key. It was scratched and worn, clearly used often. When she left, she didn't go back to her car. She walked toward the alcove. I followed at a distance, stopping well short of the fence. The camera caught everything. Her unlocking the gate, her stepping inside, her adjusting the valve. When she came out, she noticed me standing there, not close, not interfering, just present. She stiffened, nodded once, and walked away without a word. Inside, the heat spiked again, and again, it didn't last. That was when I stopped treating this like a personal dispute and started treating it like a pattern that needed a frame. I spent the evening assembling what I already had, not conclusions, just alignment. I synced my observation log with the thermostat's internal timestamps. I cross-referenced heat fluctuations with the times I'd visually confirmed valve adjustments. Then I pulled still images from the security camera's publicly accessible feed. Nothing invasive, just the frames that showed people entering and exiting the alcove at specific times. The picture that emerged was simple and uncomfortable. Access was constant, restriction was selective, impact was measurable. If you're following along and want to see how passive observation turns into something an HOA can't spin, make sure you subscribe. The next step isn't confrontation, it's exposure through process.
The next day, something changed. A notice went up on the community board announcing a temporary safety review of the fuel system. It claimed adjustments were minimizing. The language was careful, defensive. But outside, nothing actually stopped. The same vehicles came, the same people unlocked the gate, the same valve turned. What did change was how they behaved. People started looking at the camera before entering the alcove. One board member angled his body to block the view while turning the valve. Another stood just outside as if keeping watch. The sign was straightened. The cone was repositioned to look more official. They weren't fixing a problem. They were reacting to being seen. That evening, the heat in my unit dipped lower than it had all week. I checked the vent. No shimmer at all. The system wasn't just throttled now. It was effectively limited. I could hear pipes clicking as they cooled. I didn't call anyone. I didn't email. I put on my coat and went outside again. The alcove was empty, quiet, untouched for the moment. I stood there, hands visible, nowhere near the gate, and waited. When the next car arrived, a contractor's truck this time, I stepped back farther, making sure the camera showed distance and non-involvement. The contractor unlocked the gate, turned the valve, and left. The heat returned briefly. That was the final confirmation I needed. The system itself was now acting as evidence, its behavior tied directly to unauthorized adjustments by specific people at specific times, while a restriction supposedly applied to everyone. Later that night, I organized everything into a single timeline. No commentary, no accusations, just dates, times, footage references, and physical effects. I didn't send it anywhere, I saved it. Because the real leverage wasn't in showing the HOA what I had, it was in deciding who else was allowed to ask why their own cameras, their own policies, and their own actions all pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. And once that question was asked, would the board still claim the valve was dangerous, or would they finally have to explain why it was only dangerous when I wasn't the one turning it?
The outside temperature dropped into single digits the next night. Inside, the house went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. The radiators didn't hiss anymore. They clicked once, then stayed still. I stood near the exterior wall and held my hand over the vent. Nothing. No shimmer. No warmth. The system hadn't failed. It had been held back. I didn't panic. I layered up, grabbed my coat, and went outside. The snow had hardened, crunching sharply underfoot. The service alcove sat in its usual place, cones lined up neatly now, sign straightened, gate closed. It looked compliant, professional, safe. I stopped well short of the fence, exactly where the camera could see my hands and my distance. At 9:11 p.m., headlights appeared. A board member's car pulled in, slower than usual. He sat inside for a full minute before getting out, scanning the area. He saw me. I nodded, stepped back another pace, and stayed still. He hesitated, longer this time, then walked to the gate, unlocked it, and stepped inside the alcove. He turned the valve. I didn't need to see how much. The response was immediate. Inside my unit, the pipes groaned, then warmth surged through the vent like a released breath. I stayed outside, counting silently. 3 minutes. 5. 8. Then he turned it back. The heat didn't cut off instantly. It faded, like a dimmer switch slowly being rolled down. By the time he locked the gate and drove away, the vent was already cooling. That was the night the system itself became the clearest witness. I went back inside and documented nothing new. I didn't add commentary. I didn't annotate. I simply synced one more timestamp. Valve adjustment observed. Heat response recorded. Restriction effect confirmed. The pattern was now complete. The next morning, I woke to a message from the HOA. It announced an emergency review meeting scheduled for later that week. Attendance was encouraged. The language was neutral, but the timing wasn't. Something had shifted. Outside, the alcove had changed again. The cones were gone, the sign had been removed, the gate was locked. But this time, there were no fresh footprints leading to it, no tire tracks nearby. The place looked untouched. It was the first day in nearly a week that no one had visited the valve by mid-morning.
Inside, the heat stabilized. Not strong, but consistent. Enough to keep the house livable without spikes or drops. That steadiness told me more than any notice ever could. They had stopped touching it. At the emergency meeting, the board sat stiffly at the front of the room. The property manager avoided eye contact. A few residents murmured quietly, bundled in winter coats they hadn't bothered to take off. The valve was the first agenda item. The board chair spoke about miscommunication and temporary measures. She said the restriction had been misunderstood. She said the goal was safety. She said they were reviewing procedures to ensure fairness. I didn't interrupt. I didn't accuse. When public comment opened, I stood and asked one question. If access to the valve is restricted for safety, why did heat levels in my unit change every time specific individuals accessed it, while I was prohibited from doing so? The room went quiet. The chair asked what I meant. I didn't explain. I didn't editorialize. I told her I had a timeline correlating valve access with system behavior, supported by camera footage and temperature data. I asked whether the board wanted that information entered into the meeting record. She hesitated. Then she said yes. That was all it took. After the meeting, the property manager approached me privately. She said the board was concerned about perception. She said they didn't want things to escalate. She suggested the restriction might be lifted soon. I told her I wasn't asking for favors. I was asking for consistency. The next day, a formal notice appeared on the HOA portal. The violation against my unit was marked void. The restriction was removed. A new interim policy was posted stating that valve access would be limited to documented emergencies only and logged uniformly regardless of who accessed it. No apology, no admission, just correction. Outside, the alcove remained untouched. The camera blinked steadily, recording nothing but snow drifting across the concrete. Inside, the heat flowed evenly for the first time in days. I saved the final version of my timeline and backed it up. I didn't share it. I didn't need to. The outcome had already arrived, not through confrontation, but through the quiet pressure of evidence that aligned too perfectly to ignore. But as winter deepened and the board rushed to finalize its new equal access rules, one question lingered, one they hadn't answered publicly and probably hoped no one would ask. If the valve was never truly dangerous, what other rules only existed until someone started watching?
The neighborhood settled into a new kind of quiet after that. Not the uneasy quiet of cold rooms and throttled heat, but the silence that comes when a system is finally left alone. Snow fell again 2 days later, heavier this time, the kind that bends tree branches and muffles sound. I watched it from the window as the heating ran steadily, evenly, without the sharp surges or sudden drop-offs I'd grown used to. The vent shimmered consistently now. No guessing, no waiting for someone else's schedule to decide how warm my house would be. Outside, the service alcove looked almost forgotten. The cones never came back. The sign stayed down. The gate remained locked, but the latch was frosted over, untouched for long enough that the cold had reclaimed it. Each morning, the snow in front of it lay smooth and unbroken. No footprints, no tire tracks. The camera still blinked red, but now it had nothing interesting to record. That absence was the final confirmation. A week later, the HOA posted its revised policy. It was longer than the interim notice, full of precise language and careful phrasing. Valve access was now limited to defined emergency conditions. Any adjustment required logging, any access required documentation, and most importantly, any restriction had to apply to all units equally. No exceptions, no special categories. I printed it and walked it down to the alcove, standing well outside the fence as I read it aloud to myself. The policy didn't mention me, it didn't mention violations, it didn't mention what had happened, but it didn't need to. The system was doing what the words now claimed it always had. At the next board meeting, the tone was different. The chairs spoke more slowly. The property manager deferred more often. When the fuel system came up, it was framed as a learning experience. No one used the word dangerous anymore. After the meeting, a neighbor approached me quietly. He said his heat had been inconsistent during that same week. He asked if I thought it was related. I told him the system had been adjusted more than anyone realized, and that consistency came from visibility, not confrontation. He nodded. He didn't ask for details.
Over the following days, I noticed subtle changes. Notices were more specific. Enforcement emails cited exact clauses instead of vague authority. Maintenance visits were announced in advance. Small things, but they added up. The HOA hadn't become perfect, but it had become careful, and that, more than anything, told me the lesson had landed. If you've made it this far and want more stories about how ordinary people navigate high-stakes HOA conflicts without shouting or risking monetization, subscribe. These situations happen more often than you think, and the details matter. Winter carried on. Temperatures dropped and rose. The system handled it without drama. I stopped checking the vent constantly, stopped listening for the pipes. The house became just a house again. One afternoon, as I walked past the alcove on my way to the mailbox, I noticed something new. A small plaque had been mounted inside the fence, visible through the mesh. It listed emergency contact numbers and a simple instruction: all access logged per policy. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't defensive. It was quiet accountability bolted into place. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, watching my breath fog the air. The camera blinked overhead. I waved at it, not mockingly, just acknowledging that it was still there, still doing its job. Then I walked away. The violation never came back. The restriction was never reissued. and the board never again claimed the valve was too dangerous to be touched, at least not without explaining who exactly was allowed to touch it and why. What stayed with me wasn't the cold or the meetings or even the policy change. It was how quickly authority shifts when actions are visible and records are quiet but complete. No arguments, no threats, just a system reflecting behavior back at the people who thought they controlled it. The valve never changed, the rules did. And every time winter returns and the heat comes on smoothly, I'm reminded that the most effective pressure doesn't come from force. It comes from letting a system tell the truth about itself, one timestamp at a time.